Asha has such an amazing sense of what these talks are going to be about. Seriously. I mean, no, your intro to the talk was quite amazing. And that was a beautiful song, thank you. One time I got up here and my pages were all confused. It's like every minister's nightmare. It's like, God, where's page 3? Anyway, thank you so much for being here. And today we are going to talk about what we offer. Let me also welcome our online community. I always forget to do that. I'm so glad you're there. As I say, we don't see you, but we feel you, and you are an essential part of our community. We're glad you're here. And thank you also to the folks who are physically here for being here. So this week, starting on Tuesday, Muslims worldwide are celebrating the festival of Eid al-Adha, called the Festival of Sacrifice. As a matter of fact, this week is the week that millions, or certainly hundreds of thousands of Muslims from all over the world converge on Mecca for the Hajj. Those who know the Hajj is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. Every Muslim who is able is required to make an annual or make a pilgrimage to Mecca at least one point in their life, and this is the week. And in the middle of the Hajj is the celebration of the Festival of Sacrifice called Eid al-Adha. The holiday commemorates the story of Ibrahim, who is visited by God in a dream and told to sacrifice his son Ishmael to show his devotion to God. So I bet this story sounds a little familiar because it's the same story that the Hebrew scriptures have in Genesis, except Abraham becomes Abraham and Ishmael is Isaac, different sons. But anyway, in the story, Ibrahim is told that he needs to sacrifice Ishmael to show his devotion to God, and he nearly does, only to be stopped at the last minute by the substitution of a lamb for the boy. In the Quran, Abraham and Ishmael are both prophets, and indeed Ishmael is the forefather of the Prophet Muhammad. So in the Hebrew scriptures, the story is articulated a little more in detail. So as I talk about it, what I want to do is I'm going to reference the Hebrew scriptures, but I want you to know the stories are so similar. I also want to take a look at this story in a deeper sense, in a different sense, and find out what it might mean for us. Because one of the things we do here at One World, and one of the things I love to do, is take these stories and look at them in different ways, in ways that might speak to us with a bit of a different message than might be traditionally told. So what I want to do is I want to talk about sacrifice, what it might mean for us, what offering might mean for us today, with imagery that we might be able to apply to our lives. So in Genesis, where it's told in a little more detail, the story is very similar. God determines that he is going to test Abraham. Remember that? In Genesis 22, it says, God determines to test Abraham. So he calls to Abraham, who he says, Abraham, who responds, here I am. And God says, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love. Just to remind the guy, whom you love, your only son, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountaintops I will tell you about. In the Quran, the mountaintop is Mount Ararat, but in the Hebrew scriptures, it's just a mountain that he will tell them about. Okay, so what happens? Abraham sets out with Isaac, right, with the wood and the oil and the whatever, and 2 other guys, and they journey along. And at some point, as they're heading up toward where the sacrifice is supposed to be, Isaac, who is a smart young man, says, Father, there's the wood, there's the oil, there's the whatever, but where's the lamb for the sacrifice? And Abraham says, God will provide the sacrifice himself, my son. And so on they go. So we know how the story ends. Abraham sets out the wood and the fire and the whatever, and as he raises the knife, the angel Gabriel yells out, Abraham, Abraham, just as the knife is like right there, and tells him, do not lay a hand on the boy, do not do anything to him, because I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Later, after all this, the angel goes on to tell Abraham that because of his faithfulness, he will be blessed. His descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky, as numerous as the sand on the seashore, and all nations will be blessed because of his faithfulness. So a lot of times this is where we leave the story, right? The story speaks of a father's willingness to sacrifice the person that he loves most in the world in order to show his devotion to God. It's especially meaningful because if you're familiar with the story, you know that Isaac was sorely wanted and was not was the son of Abraham's old age, right? Remember the story how Abraham and Sarah had no children and they were 1,000,000 years old. Okay, that's my saying, but they were pretty old. And they had no children and they needed, Abraham really wanted a son, and Sarah felt bad because she was barren. So the angel Gabriel comes to Sarah and says, you will bear a son. And Sarah, who is way past childbearing age, thinks this is so funny. She laughs in the guy's face, saying, this is not going to happen. But it does. And the child of Abraham and Sarah is Isaac. Now we know that Abraham had earlier had a son through Hagar, Sarah's servant woman, and that son was Ishmael, who is, in the story, the son who's to be sacrificed. Anyway, getting back to the Genesis version, Isaac was a much beloved and much wanted son. So for Abraham to do what he did was an extraordinarily difficult thing. This was the son of his old age, his only son. And he was going to do it just because God asked. Just because God said, this is what you need to do. He didn't know what he was going to get in return, right? Because all the millions of descendants was coming later. He didn't bargain for it. He didn't ask for anything. God said, sacrifice your son. Abraham said, okay. There was nothing that he knew he was getting for it. He didn't ask why he was supposed to do it. He didn't say, he wasn't like Job. He didn't like bargain with the guy and talk to the guy for many, many chapters. He just did it. And then we have this image of this God, which is really hard to swallow. We have an image of this God who would say, who would say to somebody, take your only son, the son whom you love, and go to this mountain and sacrifice. Who does that? Right? How many folks do you know who have looked at that God and said, no, 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 that is not my God. That is not the God that I'm going to worship, because that's just cruel. Even if at the last minute he switches it and there's a ram in the bushes and we know how all that worked out. He went the whole way. He took his son. He walked and he said, I'm going to do this every step of the way. He thought that he was going to have to do this. What a horrible burden to lay on someone. That is not a God that a lot of people choose to worship. So the focus has always been, or has often been, on what God demanded and Abraham's steadfastness in going through with this act. The lesson is what? The surface lesson is what? If we do what God asks, we will be rewarded, right? Is that the lesson that a lot of us got? That was Abraham. You know, if we do what God asks, we will be rewarded if we put God first. Now, as I was coming up in a more traditional church, or what we call organized religion, which I don't know where that puts one world, except getting past that. Okay.
It's organized.
Yeah, we're just organized. Yeah, really, we're just organized spirituality. Come one, come all, right? The story did not resonate with me because I did not believe in a God that would ask for such a demonstration. I did not believe in a God that said, you have to prove your love for me by proving your willingness to kill something you love more than anything. I believe in a God that teaches and that lives that the love between people, the love between us, is the strongest demonstration of that holy power. That shows the love that created us all. So as I was preparing this talk, I thought about these stories. I didn't dismiss them because I kept thinking there was something there. Because I am a big proponent, as you know, of taking these stories and looking at them differently, believing they teach us something. If we are willing to just sit with them. If we're willing to just let them kind of percolate. It's what Thomas Merton calls seeds of contemplation. Right? You just put them in and you think about them. You think there's got to be something here. And so for the last few days I was just sitting with this story. And all of a sudden I was in a deeply spiritual place, which geographically was the parking lot at Walmart. And this image came to me. So I carried a little notebook and I wrote it down. And it meant something to me. So I wanted to share it with you. What this story might mean. I understood the lesson as it's framed above, but I thought there is more to it. So I changed my view from God and I focused it on Abraham. was willing to answer the call. I looked at his energy. Was he fearful? No, there's nothing in this story that says Abraham is fearful. There's nothing in this story that says he's bargaining or that he's hesitating. He listens to the voice of God and he just goes forward. The same is true of the son in the Quran. This is not in the Genesis version, but in the Quran, Ibrahim has the dream and he goes to Ishmael and he says, "My son, I have had a dream. I am meant to sacrifice you. Do you consider this?" And he asks him if he'll do it before they even head out. And in Surah 37 of the Quran, Ismail answers, "My father, do as thou art bidden. Thou shalt find me, God willing, one of the steadfast." He says, fine. This is what we need to do. Just acceptance. No fear, no bargaining, just acceptance. So for me, that became the seed of the story, not of God demanding, but of us being willing. Of us being willing to listen. Of us being willing to hear. We have to take our own meaning from these ancient stories, because if they're going to continue to live, that's the only way it's going to happen. What is spirituality about? Spirituality is about each of us in our own heart, in our own being, recreating that connection that the founder had, the guy who started this religion, that aha moment that this is God and we are connected. We do that ourselves, and we do that through many ways, one of which is making these stories living and meaningful to us. And the way we do that is by looking at them in a way that makes sense to us in a fresh way. We think about them. Joan Chittister once said that ideas are the coin of the spiritual realm. So think about an idea. What is an idea? It's an insight you have, right? As opposed to what you are taught. We develop spiritually by continuing to have those insights and by using them to advance on our spiritual path. And sometimes the food for those insights is these stories, even if somebody calls them Holy Scripture and tells us we can only think about them one way, right? As I was getting ready for this talk, I read an article by a priest or a minister in a Presbyterian church, I think, who said that you can only think about these stories in one way. You're not allowed to use your imagination, because to use your imagination is real sin. So we're all sinning here, because I'm calling on you to use your imagination and make these truths real for you. The notion is liberating, because what we do is we take this curtain of what we've been told and we just don't even peek behind it, we just tear it down. Sometimes I think it would be very fun to take these scriptural stories and take the characters and the relationships and the plot, and that's it, and just make up a point of our own. Wouldn't it? Just say, okay, this is the story of the Good Samaritan, and I haven't done this yet, but just take the plot and the relationship and the characters and what happens and say, okay, like detectives, we're going to spin it out and make a point of our own using these stories. That would be fun to do. Okay, but let's not do it now because I only have 20 minutes. We are not limited to truths that others have found. The truths are only truths if we find them. I also thought a lot about reading the Bible literally, right? Because what are we told these days? In our culture, ever since the Great Awakening, the evangelical movement, we are told that reading the Bible literally is what devout people do. There's no other way. And what does that mean? That means when one says reading the book, Sydney's shaking her head. When one means reading the Bible literally, that means giving the words the normal sense in which they are normally understood, right? So if in Joshua it says the sun stood still, what does it mean when you stand still? You stand still. So the sun literally stood still. That's what we have to think. That is literal reading. But what does it do? It makes the scriptures small. It removes the power and the depth and the meaning that is there if we dig a little deeper, if we use our imagination. One of the greatest theologians of the 20th century was Karl Barth. And he is quoted as saying, "I take the Bible way too seriously to read it literally." So that's kind of my mantra. So let's think about these stories. Let's think about it allegorically. Do you all know what an allegory is? An allegory,
Similar?
yeah, it's similar. It's a way of getting spiritual meaning from a story. It's not a metaphor. A metaphor is a figure of speech. But an allegory is a way of getting spiritual meaning using forms and images that don't exactly mean that, but can be read that way. So let's look at this story of Abraham and Isaac, or Abraham and Ishmael, from an allegorical perspective. What do we start with? We start with what we think of God, right? I start with my relationship with God. Do I think of God as a detached being up in the heavens that is going to appear to me? No. I think of God as here and here and here, and in what Richard Rohr calls the circle dance of relationship. That is where God is, in the mix of all of it. So when God appears to Abraham, what does that mean? That means I become conscious of my God self, right? I become conscious of my inner divine essence. My own sense of that divine connection speaks to me. Spirit appears to my understanding, to my consciousness. God then calls on Abraham to sacrifice his beloved son, whom you love, his only son. What does that mean? What could that mean? Again, it's not calling me to sacrifice a person. It's an allegory. The question becomes this: what is my divine self calling on me to sacrifice, to get to my greater unfolding? What is my divine essence, my God self, calling on me to put aside, to release, as Asha said in her intro, to surrender, to get to my holier self, to get to that more unified place, to get further on my spiritual path? That is what that story meant to me. It's not what does God demand of me, but what is my own divine self calling on me to sacrifice, to release, to let go, even if it's something really hard, even if it's something really dear, even if it's something that is the only thing I won't give up, like my only son whom I love. To get from here to there, to get to, in Abraham's story, the father of nations, one whose descendants were as numerous as the sand in the seashore and the stars in the sky, and a blessing to all the families of the earth. He had to go through this. God didn't tell him that he had won all those things until he went through it, until he was willing to put that aside and answer the call of his own divine nature. When I look at the story that way, what is God calling me to sacrifice, to walk into my divine self? That becomes a question only each of us can answer. Could it be my sense of who I am? Could it be my ego? Could it be my job? Could it be a relationship that I put first? Abraham is revered because he put God first. What does that mean to us? It doesn't mean we put a separate God. Oh, I'm going to God first. No, it means we find ways to live in the fullness of our own divinity. We put ourselves first, our true selves first, not our ego selves first, our essential selves first, our divine selves first. And in so doing, we come to the flowering and the unfolding of all that we are. That's how we win. But sometimes to get there, we have to sacrifice things that are so hard and that we so resist in order to do that. So we ask ourselves, what is your Isaac? What is your Ishmael? That is the hardest thing to move past, to move into your divine self. That's what this story, as I was sitting at Walmart, meant to me. And it's by going through, and maybe it means something entirely different to you, and that's great, and I want to hear about it. Because that's what communities like this do. We take these insights and these ideas and we say, yes, it means that, but it also means that. This is my Isaac, this is my Ishmael. I think that's crap. Let's talk about it from my perspective. That's how we all grow, individually and in community. Does that make sense?
Yes.
This is a question to ask. It's just a wonderful question to ask. The word sacrifice means to make holy. By moving past those things that scare us, that separate us, that stop us, we move into our greater holiness. We move into our greater unfolding. Now, you all know that I am an admirer of Mark Nepo. Y'all have heard of Mark Nepo. He wrote the Book of Awakening. It's a wonderful book. And he wrote about sacrifice. And this is what, I want to read this to you. This is what he thinks about it. And it goes along with what I've been saying many thousands of years later, a later story. His little section is called Giving Up What No Longer Works. And he writes, burning your way to center is the loneliest fire of all. You'll know you have arrived when nothing else will burn. You know you have arrived when there's nothing else to give up. You're just there. You're one. Your Atman has merged into the Brahma, if we can put it that way. He says, at first this sounds rather somber, but from Moses to Buddha to Jesus, the deepest among us have all shown that living is a process of constantly paring down until we carry only what is essential. We move from sacrifice to release to letting go to moving on till we carry only what is essential. He says, it is the same in the human journey as in the natural world. As the center grows stronger, what once was protective turns into a covering, like tree bark or snake skin that is now in the way. And sooner or later, we as spirits growing in bodies are faced with burning old skins, like rags on sticks, to light our way as we move deeper and deeper into the inner world where the forces of God make us one. Isn't that a wonderful image? As we move deeper and deeper, releasing what is not essential. He writes, in truth, always needing to stay immediate by removing what is no longer real is the working inner definition of sacrifice. Giving up with reverence and compassion what no longer works in order to stay close to what is sacred. So as we leave here today, let's just ask, as we move into our greater unfolding, as we celebrate the events of our lives, what is our Isaac? What is our Ishmael that we must let go in order to move into our greater awakening? So let's take these thoughts into meditation.